everybody. I'm Chris Thompson, and this is session number 6 of Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel. He is the creator of the chess opening known as the Jack-o'-lantern attack. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Mike Mandel.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here again, speaking to you from the very epicenter of world hypnosis, beautiful, cosmopolitan, 3 million people, Toronto, Canada, with safe public transit, world-class museums and opera, and we need you to come and study with me.
Okay, Mike, I gotta ask you, what the heck is the Jack-o'-lantern attack in chess, and does this have anything to do with hypnosis or influence or anything like that?
Actually, it does, Chris, which is kind of funny. The Jack-o'-lantern attack, if anybody wants to Google it, you'll find my writings on the subject. I wanted to create a brand new chess opening, and for those chess players out there, basically it starts with d4, and if the opponent responds with anything other than d5, my immediate response is d5. And what that does is it pushes the queen's pawn much too far forward. And the brilliance of the opening is it's so incredibly stupid. It's not in any chess book I've seen. I've looked this up in Batsford and modern chess openings and so on. It doesn't exist anywhere. I call it the Jack-o'-lantern attack and wrote it up extensively on chess.com. And the wonder of it is, because it's so bizarre, it actually annoys your opponent and causes him to make stupid moves. And when you're playing online and have a 10-minute or 15-minute time limit, even 30, 40 seconds can be a huge advantage. And so I began playing this with alarming frequency and wound up writing an article on the Jack-o'-lantern attack and also other chess openings I was using at the time. And that began to be an entire system of winning online with bizarre chess psychology, messing with people's minds online.
Okay, so I haven't played chess in a long time, but back when I was in like grade 6, I beat my grade school teacher in the game, and I was really proud of myself. And I guess chess has a scoring system to it, right? I mean, if you play online, there's a number associated to your skill level.
An ELO score, okay. An ELO level, yeah.
So if you have a good score and you open with what is perceived as a really stupid move,
a ludicrous move,
it's a pattern interrupt in a way, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So,
I've had people say, that's not a move. That's just ridiculous. And still I play. I had one man quit after 6 moves when he realized he was facing the ferocity of the Jack-o'-lantern attack, because this move, as I explained, shows that white is no friendly visitor to black's castle, but has concealed within the folds of his cloak a grinning, grotesque Jack-o'-lantern that he will use to batter down the portcullis, force his way into the castle, kill the sentries, and drag the king screaming into the courtyard and commit regicide.
So the reason we brought all this up is because we've planned this...
You brought it up!
The reason I brought it up is because we planned this entire show to talk about messing with people's minds.
Influence and messing with people's minds, that's right.
So that's how we wanted to start the show. So, Mike, I wanted to ask you about the time that you were at the World Chess Championships, and I believe Garry Kasparov was there.
That's right. I was in England at the time, and I went to the Savoy Theatre and had second-row seats for the World Chess Championship. The Professional Chess Association battle between Nigel Short, the British Grandmaster, who's actually quite brilliant, and Garry Kasparov, who, of course, is off the scale brilliant. And the match was phenomenal. But it gave me an opportunity to mess with people's heads in a really enjoyable way, because the Savoy was beautifully outfitted for the event, and there were 2 different areas you could go when you tired of watching the match. Now, you were given an infrared receiver. You could listen to Grandmaster commentary, or you could go out in the lobby. And because a game would last hours, you could go out into one of 2 different lobbies and buy food and beer and stuff, which was amazing. Well, on one level was Grandmaster Tony Miles, a British Grandmaster who's since deceased, which is rather unfortunate. And on the other level was Grandmaster Graham Keane. I don't know if he's still with us. I hope so, Graham. Anyway, I went to the one level where Tony Miles was holding court, and he had a massive board set up, and the game was being analyzed on a computer as well, a Fritz program, and everyone was waiting to see what move Kasparov would make. And everyone assumed it was going to be f6, including me, which was a pawn move. But Miles cleverly said, no, he said it won't be f6, it'll be f5 instead. And people said, well, why? And they argued with him and got all outraged. And Tony Miles said, because Kasparov is aggressive. He's a tiger. He's not going to make a passive move like f6. He's going to make a f5 and move towards the center and be much more aggressive. And there was quite a bit of argument about this. And I found this interesting and listened to all the salient points. Walked up to the next floor of my sandwich, where Graham Keane was holding court at his board, and they were trying to determine what the next move was going to be. And everyone was saying f6, and I raised my hand. And they said, Yes, and I said, I believe Kasparov will play f5. And everyone burst out laughing like I was a lunatic. And Graham Keane said, no, I want to hear why. And I said, well, Kasparov is a tiger. He's an aggressor. He doesn't make passive moves. He's going to storm the center. He's going to lunge in with a thrust with f5. I mean, obviously. And everyone mocked me to scorn. And he said, no, I quite agree with him. It's a good point. And then they all shut up, and it was hilarious. And, of course, Kasparov played f5 in this particular variation of the Najdorf Sicilian defense. And it was infinitely enjoyable because all I was doing was playing them against each other, listening to what one grandmaster said and feeding it down at the other table. I went back and forth with this for about an hour to my own amusement.
So basically borrow the brilliance of one and feed it to another.
Essentially, yes.
That's great. So let's talk about messing with people's minds then, and let's begin with
That's why we're here, Chris.
Classic Ericksonian tool known as embedded commands, otherwise known as analog marking. Or actually, Mike, good question. Is there a difference between an embedded command and analog marking? And we should explain to the audience what these things mean.
Okay, that's really interesting. Basically, analog marking is the means one uses to embed commands. Now, embedded commands, embedded statements, and embedded questions are commands, statements, and questions concealed within ostensibly normal verbal communication. In other words, if I say, I don't want you to fall into a trance very quickly, I can embed the command fall into a trance within it by saying it slightly differently. I don't want you to fall into a trance very quickly. So what I'm doing is I'm marking those parts of the sentence. Oh, by the way, wide awake now. I'm marking those parts of the sentence using something called analog marking. Now realize the difference between analog and digital, which is what makes this work. Digital is black or white. It's on or off. It's either or. Whereas analog is the dimmer switch. There's multitude shades of gray between black and white, an infinite number, in fact. And an analog marking is a marking of a part of a sentence, so it becomes an embedded question, an embedded statement, or an embedded command, simply by saying it slightly differently, a bit louder, a bit softer, a vocal tone shift, looking at the person at that part in the sentence, touching them as you say that part to underline it, all of which enables that sentence fragment to slip past the critical faculty into the unconscious mind undetected, whereupon it acts as a powerful, unconscious communication.
Okay, I think you answered the question about analog marking versus embedded commands then, which is, if I interpret it correctly, that analog marking is the method with which you embed the command. And the next thing I think we should talk about is how subtle do you need to be? Because I have listened to so many extreme variations of this where I don't want you to forget everything right now in a really non-subtle, really obvious.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, the key is you want to be subtle enough that the conscious mind does not detect it. Because if the conscious mind has detected it, so has the critical faculty, and the person can delete it and pay no attention to it. It must be subtle enough to be unconsciously detected alone. Remember, I said at one point, I think in another podcast, a man wanted to take my master hypnosis course but had never taken my basic hypnosis course. And he left a message on my answering machine, and it was all that sort of thing. It was, and as you begin to listen to me now, and you can find that you will go into a deep trance. And it was so over the top. It was pathetic. It was absolutely in your face. And none of it was working unconsciously.
And I think we actually analog mark already in normal conversation. We just aren't necessarily aware of it, right? I mean, we don't
emphasis.
Yeah, we don't intend to embed commands, but we can get worked up about a topic, and we can embed commands without even knowing it.
That's right. We're not necessarily trying to get someone to forget where you're going with this.
That's right. Nice try. Although I do remember when Adam from Jiu-Jitsu, he analog marked "forget your way home" one night a few years ago after class, and I knew he was doing it, but it still sunk in. And I made the wrong turn. I made a right turn when I should have made a left, and I'm wondering, where the hell am I driving? And
so you made a wrong turn instead of a right turn,
which was a left turn rather than the right one.
But then you did make a right turn to counter the wrong turn afterwards.
That's right.
So where does the left turn fit into what was right?
Yeah, that's right.
Wide awake now.
And I went the wrong way when I should have gone the right way.
Don't feel free to do it again, Chris.
And the right way that is left is the wrong way.
Correct.
So actually, that's a little nice segue. Let's talk about you're masterful at this, Mike. Let's talk about confusion and overdoing the negatives.
Oh, wait a minute. But before you get to confusion and overdoing the negatives, since you have already forgotten where we're up to, in response to the command I gave you a while ago, he's just broken over here. He's bent over laughing, and his face is bright red, and his veins standing out in his forehead. So come back. Come back, Chris. What I wanted to mention in the embedded commands was an example of this. When I was teaching for NLP Canada training at the University of Toronto years ago, we had a young lady, Laura, who came in from Vancouver to do the training with me. And she was a wonderful hypnosis student. But about the second day, she said, "Can you talk about subtle hypnosis and indirect suggestion and so on?" And I said, "Yes." And I just let my unconscious mind go. And I told her a story about a young man who used to attend my public school and then my high school. His name was Jimmy Vaughn. And we had 2 Jimmys in the class. And Jimmy Vaughn, we wound up calling him Jimmy V. V for Vaughn. And I lost touch with him. And he moved to Boston. And he actually became a stellar student. And he wound up studying at Harvard University. And he got an MBA. And he was doing very well in business. And many years later, when I was in my 30s, I got in touch with Jimmy Vaughn again. And I was going down through Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire on a trip. And I said, "Do you want to connect and we'll grab lunch?" And he was extremely interested. And he gave me a location to meet him in Boston at Boston Common. And at the time, it was pretty run down, a lot of street people. It was pretty rough. And I met him in the area by the statue where he wanted me to meet him. And I was standing there waiting for Jimmy Vaughn to arrive. And he came walking towards me, and I saw him immediately with his perfect suit, his Armani suit, and his tie, and his briefcase, and his grin, and his perfect hair. And it was him again. I mean, I hadn't seen him since high school. And I yelled, "Hey, Jim V, I can't remember when I last saw you. What are you doing in this seedy part of town?" And we had lunch together. It was a great time, and I haven't seen him since, but we will still keep in touch at some point, or connect again. So I told this story to Laura in the class, and she went into state, and her lower lip increased in size, and her breathing shifted, and her eyes became glazed, and her face flushed at the end of the story. And she just said, okay. And we did the class. And 2 days later, I couldn't resist. And every class has a 90-minute lunch because we have to walk into Yorkville, which is an upscale area of Toronto, which I haven't mentioned is ground zero and the epicenter of world hypnosis. And so we're walking into Yorkville, and day by day, going for lunch. And just before we left for lunch on Thursday, I said to Laura, "Have you bought the new Radiohead CD yet?" And she looked startled and said, "I was going to buy it today. How could you possibly know that?" And I said, "Because I embedded the command on Tuesday." Now realize, every day, we all walk together as a group to a restaurant called Yamato in Toronto, and as we walked past HMV, there was a huge Radiohead display in the front window with their new album.
HMV, for those of you who aren't in Canada, is a music store. They sold CDs at the time, so that's why
they're all over the world, actually, Chris.
Are they?
Yes,
okay.
They are. Wide awake now. And so as we passed the store every day, there would be this huge display. Everyone would see it was Radiohead's new CD, and it was called Amnesia, which is actually a great record if you want to pick it up. And I gave her the command on Tuesday. "Hey, Jimmy V," which is HMV, "I can't remember, amnesiac, when I last saw you. What are you doing in this CD area of town?" So we put into her brain amnesiac, CD, and HMV. And her unconscious mind did the rest. She had already intended to buy it. Now, because she was young and not sort of a stodgy old woman. She was young and up to date and knew what the music scene was. I realized she would probably buy it if she hadn't already. I wouldn't have attempted this with a woman in her 70s in a wheelchair.
Okay, now I have to redeem myself for not knowing that HMV is a global music
store. Too
late. So let me ask you a couple of hopefully astute questions as a student of yours. I noticed that when you do embedded commands, you tend to build up a very in-depth story with lots of details. Now, I'm assuming you're doing this to occupy the conscious mind. All of those 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information are occupied with a story.
When I want you to forget.
Right. So when you end up slipping a command in using an embedded command, it goes straight through the critical faculty, right into the unconscious mind. And
undetected.
Works much more powerfully, right?
Yes, the key is to keep people caught up in content. Keep the conscious mind entertained. This is pure John Grinder, and
Perfect. All right, so that is a discussion of embedded commands. Now, I had started to lead us into a discussion of overuse of negatives and confusion, because we had been joking about that earlier. So let's talk about that.
Right. Well, the overuse of negatives is a very interesting thing because it's very, very difficult for the conscious mind to keep track of the negation. If you start piling them on top of each other, you have negatives negating negatives and so on. And a number of years ago, a young man in his early 30s, young to me, he was over at our place, and I was telling him about this church near us that had a singles group. Now, he was recently divorced and was looking to get a good woman in his life. And we got talking, and I said, do you know there's a singles group near here? And the woman, this beautiful woman who runs it, I was telling her about you, and she was saying they have an event coming up. And he said, well, what did you say? Did you tell her I'd like to go? And I said, well, I thought about it and realized that I couldn't say that I wouldn't be at all interested in not believing that you wouldn't possibly be interested in not going, so I didn't.
And what did he say to you?
Well, when he came out of trance...
I think he had some choice curse words for you, which we can't repeat on a family-friendly show here.
Yeah.
I remember that story. So the idea, and I've done that lots of times to people, and it's a lot of fun. You can just stack the negatives and watch the confusion.
And confusion is always a very, very useful means of creating leverage to get into a trance state.
Now, great segue, because I was going to ask you, when you've got the state of confusion, this is your opening to embed a command, as an example with what we just talked about, right?
Oh, definitely. And maybe not even embed a command, but just bypass the critical faculty. The critical faculty is interesting insofar as certain words seem to bypass it almost immediately. Unfortunately, Chris, one of these words is hypnosis. And the number of times, I've got to tell you this is so bizarre. The number of times I have seen people behind me on the road go into a trance because of my car. Now, my license plate is Hypnosis. And when Ontario, Canada switched to 8 digits from 7, I had been waiting quietly in the wings, and I was on my way to Atlanta or something by plane. And my wife phoned me at Toronto Airport and said, they have just said they're going to do 8 digits now, and you can phone in and pre-book something. I said, phone and get Hypnosis right away. And she said, well, I can call tomorrow. And no. I want this. Put it on my visa. Get Hypnosis for me right away. So she did. But the problem is, I'll pull up to a traffic light in my car, and the person behind me sits there, and I look in the mirror, and I see them look at the license plate, and then they mouth the word Hypnosis. And then I just watch their eyes glaze. And the number of times I drive away, and then they sort of start, and then they follow me, it's just unbelievable. It's a word that slips past the critical faculty, as does the word amnesia.
Okay, so if you are going to use a confusion technique to open up the critical faculty, you can embed command, you can give direct suggestion, anything else you can do. What else can you do?
Well, it doesn't really matter. You just have to think which direction you want to lead them and say which language pattern will lead them in that direction. For example, a number of years ago, we had a martial artist, Clive Elliott, came to Toronto, who wrote me up in Martial Arts Illustrated when I was in Britain teaching martial arts, not even hypnosis. And he brought a bunch of his students to Toronto, and they were studying here. And one of them in a restaurant, I brought confusion into his state through particular ways of speaking to him, put him into a confused state. And I had a deck of cards in my hand, and I started tapping it on the table by rotating it in a repetitive pattern and said, that's right, all the way into trance. And this guy, Steve, went into a hypnotic state just watching me tap these cards on the table. And Clive said, what's the matter with him? I said, nothing's the matter with him. He's in a deep hypnotic trance. And they spoke to him, and he didn't answer. And I said, Steve, your wine's here. And he just jumped up. He said, did I order wine? Did I order wine? And they said, yeah, it's coming with your pizza. Did I order pizza? He was completely freaked out. And I used confusion as an inroad, anchored it, as in the previous example from the other podcast, by tapping the deck of cards. Then it reached the point that we all went to the Eaton Centre a couple of days later, which is a huge shopping centre in Toronto, a huge mall, and began tapping a deck of cards on the table. And Steve just set his stuff down, stared at them, and went right back into trance immediately.
Okay, Mike, what other words will slip past their critical faculty?
Well, we're talking undetected, right? The way you can have an influence. One of them, of course, is amnesia, as I alluded to a moment ago. The word amnesia. Years ago, my wife and I were at an event called Canada Blooms, which is a huge gardening show in Toronto at the Canadian National Exhibition Grounds. And we're wandering around, and I was there with another hypnotist and his wife. And he kept saying to me, do something, as people occasionally do. And as we were walking around, I said, okay, watch this guy walking towards us. So my friend and I, we're going to call him Pat. He and I are walking side by side. This other man is walking towards us, and I turning to Pat as though I'm speaking to him about something. And just as the other man approaches, is about to pass me, I just look him right in the face and said, "Amnesia," and went back and started talking to Pat again. And we walked about another 30 feet, and he said to me, you got to look, you got to look, you got to look. It's hilarious. And I turned back, and the man was standing there, just stunned, just blinking back, layers of trance, trying to figure out why I just said amnesia to him.
So amnesia goes right past the critical faculty and messes with the mind.
Yes, especially if you're doing something to startle them, to get it past the critical faculty to begin with. You need some degree of confusion or a means of getting it in. Of course, there's another word that does it too, which is sleep. That's how the sledgehammer inductions, the rapid inductions work, where you get someone in a powerful trance just in seconds. Typically, you will distract the mind by having them, spin a pendulum or something, or press down on your hand while looking into your eye, and you suddenly pull the hand away and pull the back of their neck forward. Be careful with this, you can hurt someone, and you yell, "Sleep!" And the word sleep slips past the critical faculty, and they will go into a momentary trance if you have sufficient rapport with them. If there is no rapport, they'll come out of it immediately.
All right, let's talk about the use of the word because. I know this is another powerful word that you can use to bridge one part of a sentence to another, and it can influence people. And let's talk about it.
The word because is a very powerful and very hypnotic word, insofar as anything you put in front of because, provided it is a standalone simple command, will slip past the critical faculty regardless of the reason you give. And I was teaching this in Ontario a number of years ago, and a woman from one of the large real estate companies, she was one of the top 2% real estate agents in Canada, stood up and said, I heard you speak a year ago. I want to tell you how I've used this particular technique and share it with the group. I said, go ahead. And she said her son, Scott, had not cleaned his bedroom in 2 years. She said, I'm a real estate agent. We have a big house. The bedroom was full of junk, debris, half-eaten sandwiches, banana peels, garbage, stinky socks. And she said, I had pleaded with him, threatened him, offered him rewards. Nothing worked. The room was a disaster. And she refused to clean it. And so she went home and said, I'm going to use this technique to get Scott to clean up his room. And she walked in his room. He's listening on his iPod or whatever. He had his headphones on, takes the headphones off and goes, what? Thinks he's in trouble. And she said, Scott, clean up your room, which is a standalone command. So she said, clean up your room because we're going out tomorrow. Now, the structure of the sentence with because slips the first part of the sentence past the critical faculty undetected. So Scott's brain gets the message, clean up your room. It's built into the structure of the sentence. And he looked at her surprised and said, what did you say, Mom? So she just repeated it. I said, clean up your room because we're going out tomorrow. He looked a little stunned. His eyes went all over the map as his brain did a transderivational search. And he said, okay, Mom, and started cleaning. She walked out in the hall, stunned that he had immediately started cleaning his room. She said, in 90 minutes, he was done. Now, if I said it was clean like a mother would clean it, I'd be lying. But it was much better than it was because he took out about 6 bags of garbage and never made the connection. There was no connection between clean up your room and we're going out tomorrow, which they weren't.
Power of the word because. It doesn't matter if there's a logical connection between the...
It doesn't have to be logical at all, provided everything in front of it is a standalone command.
Right, so you don't want to say, would you like to clean your room?
Right, that's a question.
Yeah, wouldn't work.
You wouldn't say, please clean your room. That's a request. It just simply clean up your room because da-da-da-da.
Right, I think the photocopier example was students doing experiments at a university, and they were looking to butt in line with... either a request, can I make some copies because I'm in a rush, and if they didn't provide a reason, it didn't work, right? And if they did provide a reason, but they had to issue it as a command, they'd say, let me make some copies because I'm in a rush.
Let me in line because I have to make some photocopies.
That's right.
And they were being let in line right away, even though everybody had to make photocopies. Nobody questioned it. So I think we should now probably close, Chris, with our ending metaphor. What do you think?
I think we should, because we have a lot more content, but no time. So we'll save it for podcast number 7.
And I'd like all of you, well, when I say all of you, I mean some of you, to come to Toronto, Canada, and study hypnosis with me with NLP Canada training right at the campus of the University of Toronto downtown at beautiful Queen's Park. and study with a group of your peers and push it to the next level. Next training is in the spring of 2012. And here is the metaphor for today. Once upon a time, many years ago, there was a young handsome prince who was 18 years old, and his father, the king, had kept him secure within the kingdom. And the prince believed all things but three. He believed there was no such thing as islands, and no such thing as princesses, and no such thing as God. And his father raised him this way. But when he reached 21, the prince decided to search the world on his own, discover what was out there, beyond the castle walls and beyond the town. And so he dressed like a normal person of his realm, instead of a prince, got on a horse, and traveled for many days outside his king's domain. And eventually he reached the coast, and out on the ocean he saw these strange tracts of land. And on the tracts of land were these beautiful young creatures wandering about. And just at that moment, as he marveled over this, he noticed a man was standing at his side. And he turned and beheld a man in full evening wear, including top hat, and with a cane. And he turned to the man and he said, "What are those things that look like land on the water?" And the man said, "Why, those are islands, my son." And he said, "Well, what are the beautiful creatures on the islands?" And he said, "Well, those are princesses." And the prince said, "But there's no such thing as islands, and there's no such thing as princesses." And the man in the evening wear just burst out laughing. And he said, "Next you're going to say there's no such thing as God." And the prince said, "There is no such thing as God." And the man bowed and said, "I am God." And the prince was puzzled and realized he'd been lied to. He got back on his horse and rode the 3 days back to the castle and confronted his father, who was sitting in the throne room. He said, "Father, you've lied to me. You told me there were no such thing as princesses or islands or God, but I have seen real islands and seen real princesses on them, and I have met God." And his father said, "Tell me, my son, what did God look like?" He said, "Well, he was wearing full evening wear with a top hat and carrying a cane." And the father said, "And were his sleeves rolled up to the elbows?" And the prince said, "Yes." And the father said, "That is the garb of a magician. He has enchanted you. You have been lied to by him." And so the prince saddled his horse again and rode 3 days back until he reached the ocean, the distant shore. And he saw the same islands were still there, and the same princesses were still there. And when he turned, sure enough, the man was there again, with his sleeves rolled up, with top hat and tails and a cane. And he said, "My father said you have lied to me. There are no princesses, and there are no islands, and you're not God." And he said, "You are being lied to by your father, my son. Those are real islands, and those are real princesses. But you have been deceived, and you are under your father's enchantment, so you cannot see them. Your father is just a magician." And the prince was startled by this. He got back on his horse and rode the 3 days back to his kingdom again, and his father again waited in the throne room. And the prince said to his father, "Father, you have lied to me. There are real princesses, and there are real islands, and there is a real God. You're just a magician. Is it true?" And the king smiled and rolled up his sleeves. And the prince said, "I do not know what is real anymore. This is more than I can bear. I choose to die." And the father said, "Very well, my son." The king made a magical gesture, and death appeared in the doorway, with his scythe and his long robes, skull-like head, beckoning to the prince to follow him. And the prince shuddered and looked back to his father. His father said, "Choose, son, this day. Choose death or magic." And the son looked back at death and said, "I choose magic." And his father said, "Roll up your sleeves, my son, because today you too have begun to become a magician."
Wide awake now. All right, thanks, Mike, for the therapeutic metaphor. I always love listening to those stories. The next episode we're going to record based on your suggestions, so always send in your questions. The email address to use is questions@MikeMandelHypnosis.com. Remember, 1 L in Mandel. Head on over to MikeMandelHypnosis.com. You can always take a look at the instant downloads available. There are several and more being added. We are just about to publish a chronic pain management product, and we'll talk about that at some point in the next podcast. And we're also considering doing some live webcasts where Mike will lead you through some live instruction followed by question and answers on topics that interest you. So if you're interested in a live webinar with Mike, then send us your key ideas for topics that you'd like to learn about. And that's it for podcast number 6 of Brain Software with Dr. Mike Mandel. I'm Chris Thompson, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Final words, Mike?
I'm not sure whether you're going to remain standing or sit down completely as you lie there and really enjoy the music. That's right.